All right. Thanks for sticking around, and also welcome to the new faces in the room. This is the second session that is organized by the PHAIR Society. So to just repeat very briefly what the PHAIR Society is and what it's doing, we are a mostly academically oriented society of mostly academic, but also researchers from research institutes in the animal advocacy landscape in that scope. And we promote and trying to support research and education on the psychology of human-animal relations, speciesism, veganism, and how to build and develop effective interventions and techniques and strategies from all kinds of angles, right? So we start this morning with a session, very interesting, by Luke Maguire and Jared Piazza on how children view animals and how they think about meat consumption. Now we move on focusing on adults, really, and how, the psychology of meat consumers really work and how they perceive vegans and vegetarians. We start with Sam Villana from the University of Edinburgh, who's doing a PhD on these topics and specifically on anti-vegan bias. Then I will talk a bit more about the ideological resistance that we can experience as vegans, as advocates in the media, but also interpersonally, and what we can do about it. Showing some research findings from large-scale studies that we recently conducted. And then Chris Bryant from Bryant Research, and still associated with University of Bath, I think. We'll talk about effective advocacy and vegan 2.0. It's up and coming. All right, without further delay, Sam, you can take it away now.
Thank you, Christoph. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this session. My name's Sam, and I'm super excited to be here today and to tell you about some of the research that I do at the University of Edinburgh on dietary prejudice. So my talk today is called 500 Years of Bias, Why We Need the Word Dietism. And I'm sure some of you in the audience will have read the 500 years part and be thinking to yourself, I could have sworn these talks were 20 minutes long. Don't worry. We bring around a coffee cart every 25 years. So bias, prejudice, discrimination. This is so prevalent as the dominant discourse that it's in our everyday conversations. We see it in the news. I have this example here from the Telegraph from January this year. Farewell, vegans, you will not be missed. Nice, right? But it's also in popular TV shows, so it's really hitting all the demographics. And I'm sure for you guys here in the audience, you will have some first-hand experience of prejudice that I would really love to hear about afterwards. Please come and tell me. I've been vegan for 20 years now, and I'm still hearing new ones. So one I can share with you today is not so long ago. It was a professional context. I really wanted to work on this project, so it was a job. And I was describing my research and expertise, and someone comes and someone turns and says to me, "It seems like you have an agenda." Right? And the really frustrating thing here is that, okay, yes, you've identified I have a passion, I have a cause that I care about. All academics do, that's why we go into our field. But this really doesn't undermine our research. Our passion only helps our research because we need to know the truth of a situation before we can then use that information to design more effective animal advocacy strategies. So I didn't get the job, but But what I have been doing instead is I have been working on mapping out how this dietary prejudice truthfully really presents in the real world. And this has really forced me to critically update my own perceptions of what is happening here as well. And so what we thought when we were doing this is that it's about time we had a word to describe dietary prejudice, honestly. So what we have put forward is dietism. A pattern of prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination that devalues those who subscribe to a different diet. And for a long time, we've studied these kind of facets of anti-vegan prejudice and discrimination as like separate things, right? So we may look at it from a masculinity lens because people think that meat is masculine, and so we criticize men who maybe don't eat meat. Historians may look at it as a class struggle, right? But it's never really been like a whole form of prejudice in and of itself. We lacked a unifying term, like a golden thread, and that absence really matters. So why is this important? First, we have a shared understanding. So naming can be a really powerful act of recognition, which reduces barriers to dialogue. And the thing is, when we have ease of dialogue, we have more momentum. And this term calls on a common framework that everyone understands. You know, we know racism, we know sexism, we know all these other isms. And if we start using the word dietism, it's really easy to get people to understand what is happening and that this is prejudice, essentially. The next one, legal leverage. So as a recognized form of prejudice, this helps enable policy and legal procedures, and we can much more easily tap into existing frameworks that are meant to manage discrimination. Cross-movement solidarity. So we can be participants in a broader conversation about identity, stigma, and systemic bias. We generally find that those who are high in one prejudice tend to be high in others. And we see dietism show up in racism, sexism, speciesism, and all the other isms too. So we do not need to be isolated. We have all these connections that we didn't know existed. It shifts the burden. So currently, when you experience some kind of prejudice or discrimination, you're talking to someone, you have to go through this whole process of explaining what they've done and why it's harmful, and maybe why they shouldn't do it. And we can just short circuit all of that, basically, by saying, that's dietism, that's a form of prejudice. You know, we don't need to explain ourselves every time if we have this ease of communication. It shifts the burden from us justifying hurt to perpetrators justifying behavior. And next, we can recognize it in action. So we can identify it faster and better, and we can learn not to let an interaction be derailed by these attitudes. Because when people start attacking us, it takes the focus away from our message, which is what's really important. So when I was mid-researching dietism, I had some really big questions that I had to answer, that all academics have to answer in a research project. Things like, does this follow the patterns we expect of prejudice? And is this distinct enough from other prejudices that it warrants its own name? And so this research started with history. And specifically in everyday history, you know, not just vegetarian or vegan specific history. And I took some inspiration from Irving Goffman, who wrote a book called Stigma. And in this book, he says, it is not to the different that we should look for understanding our differentness, but to the ordinary. So this is where I began, in normal, everyday, commonplace history. And I have a couple of highlights to show you. I promised it won't take 500 years. And the first one is this poster I have from World War II, essentially. We can see that food is a weapon, don't waste it. And this food in particular is meat. We see from the bones on the plate. And it was meant for soldiers. So what we can see happening here is that it's tying meat to power and power to men. You know, we have these links to masculinity. And I think, and I'd like your opinion on this, that I found the direct evolution of this marketing if we fast forward 80 years. So it can be a lot to take in all at once. But we can see that meat is still for men, clearly. He's a soldier, we know, because he's getting ready to attack his abs. If you can't read that at the back, that's what it says down here. It's really doing a lot, so you've got to eat like a man, have your steak in each hand as well. So exciting stuff. The imagery has changed, but the message has not. And this idea that meat is masculine is so embedded in our society that even kindergarten-aged boys held implicit biases as food being masculine or feminine, while girls the same age did not. We also know that female vegetarians and vegans are assessed more positively than their male counterparts. And in a US sample in 2023, vegans are seen as more feminine than omnivores. So going back to the two big questions I had to answer, we know that masculinity is a factor in anti-vegan prejudice, but we also know that it is more than this too. So if it was just gender, we might expect that countries that have quite good gender equality might also have fairly equal meat consumption across the sexes. But when we look at this data, we find that this is actually not the case at all. We have a larger meat divide between genders in a lot of Western societies, or societies that say they have fairly equal gender equality. So we know that it is so much more than this. It's coming from an entire political system, right? And so the next example I have, we've made it 500 years into the past. And this example is going to talk a little bit about the associations with colonization, race, and religion. So more of that political system and embedded nature. And I have this quote here from historian Rebecca Earle. And in this quote, she's describing a Spaniard who has been shipwrecked in the New World, and he has had to eat New World food, essentially. And this is the kind of attitudes people would have towards him after this. So his digestive system had gone native. In humoral terms, he had acquired a second nature. And as a result, his body was not quite as Christian as it had been prior to his shipwreck. He had begun to turn into an Indian. So diet is the only thing that has changed for this man. You know, he obviously hasn't changed race, he hasn't changed religion. So we see that diet can catalyze this prejudice. We know it functions on a common framework as racism and religious prejudice as well, because it's having these knock-on effects here. And what this one quote illustrates particularly well is that the body was so important here. Essentially, you are what you eat. And those who eat an inferior diet then are inferior. And this was 1519, a time of colonization. It was a period when Euro-whiteness was the expression of humanness, and humanness purported dominion over animals. So colonizers nearly eradicated like many native food practices, but this history of dietary oppression is largely forgotten. We do see some of these influences showing up in modern day. For instance, in the US, Asian Americans were 3 times as likely to claim that a typical American meal was their favorite, order it, and physically consume it, after their identity had been challenged. So after they'd been questioned on if they were really a citizen and if they belonged there. An Australian sample found that desire for social status explained a preference for meat as well. So we still see these class and political systems having an influence here. And these are not factors that we commonly consider in meat reduction efforts. But when we reframe our understanding towards dietism, we naturally widen the scope, and we can see how all these other influences can be huge factors for different people. So the examples I have just given are from Western histories, of course, and there is so much more to dive into from other countries and cultures too, from local perspectives. But generally in this historic research, we see examples of oppression and prejudice attitudes that follow a power or a dominance-based theme. And in research, we will often talk about social dominance orientation. And essentially what this means is how much you like social hierarchies that give your group power over other groups. And this we see is very interwoven with all forms of prejudice. So racism, sexism, and also it seems dietism. And this brings me to the current research. And there are several more specific ways that we try to understand anti-vegan dietism today. We may represent a very broad threat to someone's ideologies, like carnism, especially if they believe very strongly in these social hierarchies and class systems. Related to this is we may also trigger a threat if we're seen as representatives of animals, because this also kind of challenges class and hierarchy assumptions. Prejudice towards vegans can also be seen as a beneficial function of cognitive dissonance. So it can be a tool that helps people avoid thinking about their own behaviors that might make them uncomfortable. So basically, if they keep disliking us, then they don't have to associate with that so much. And we have all this information on these different facets of anti-vegan dietism, but we didn't have a systematic review, which is a way of synthesizing research data into one place. So this is what I have been doing. And the questions that we asked were very broad and simply, does dietism exist? And importantly, this was multi-directional. So we looked at prejudice from omnivores to vegetarians and vegans, from vegans to omnivores, and kind of all around. And after reading hundreds and hundreds of papers, we narrowed it down to a final sample of 81 studies that recorded attitudes between dietary groups. 32 of these were qualitative and 7 had mixed methods. And together, 90% of these studies showed that there was evidence of prejudice between dietary groups. And the majority of these studies, they were pretty much interviews with vegans or vegetarians who were reporting prejudice or discrimination that had happened to them. This is a high number, but this is also kind of what we would expect from our own experiences, right? But it's really nice that we actually have this statistic now from the research that is out there. But of the quantitative studies, we see that 64% overall were positive for prejudice, which is a fairly high number for quantitative studies. So 64, including people's own prejudice towards others and reports of being on the receiving end of prejudice. So kind of think of this as an overall indicator of prejudice in society from these studies. And this is a very huge piece of research. So once again, I have a couple of highlights to give you from this. And the first one that I found very fascinating is that this figure actually changes depending on how we measure it. So there's a bit of unpacking here to do. So context. This is a subset of studies that just report people's own prejudice towards others, right? We're no longer mixing perceived and own prejudice. And there are two popular ways that we will measure prejudice. And so I've looked at these side by side and reanalyzed some of the data so we can see both methods at play. The first one is looking at if they have prejudice from the midpoint of a scale. So I'm sure at some point you've all filled out surveys which go from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and in the middle it will say this is the neutral midpoint where you maybe just don't have feelings about it. And this method looks at their attitudes and then compares it to the neutral midpoint on the scale. So looking at prejudice from this perspective, we see that only 13% of studies showed that they actually had negative attitudes. Alternatively, we can look at it as in-group bias. And this method involves comparing how people feel about the other group to how they feel about their own group. So an example of this is that we may take a measure for how much omnivores like other omnivores, and then for how much they like vegans, and we'll look at the difference between them and see if that's significant. And when we analyzed the studies by this method, we found that 70% were actually showing significant negative attitudes, which is a huge number, and this is a huge difference. So it really matters how we measure it. And this is another reason why, perhaps in research as well, having the term dietism could be really important for academics to stay aligned. And while these are not interchangeable concepts, they do give us a really useful insight. Other dietary groups are not objectively disliked on a scale, but we like those similar to us a lot more. And the next question we might be thinking of here is, how extreme is this difference between how much we like our own group and other groups? Well, there was one study by McInnes and Hodson a few years ago that showed these ratings of vegans were actually comparable to other marginalized groups. In fact, the only group that people rated lower than vegans in the study were drug addicts. So another study showed that this translates to rates of discrimination, and how people rated vegans, vegetarians in this were actually comparable to Kurdish group members in Turkey and the physically disabled. So from these findings, clearly it complicates the data. And I want to ask you to really interrogate what approach is going to be most informative when we look at this. Because given these results, perhaps the midpoint on a scale is really not the true neutral position at all. And it may be that it's much more informative to communicate to the public what prejudice looks like towards vegans and vegetarians when we consider comparisons to other marginalized groups. And so, moving on to the next interesting finding that I had. When we looked at perceived prejudice, we found, of studies I could reanalyze as well, there were 5 studies that asked omnivores if they had perceived prejudice. None of them said yes. And there were 10 studies that asked vegans if they had, been the targets of prejudice, and 9 out of 10 said yes. So, this kind of makes sense, right? But we just looked at people's own negative attitudes towards the outgroup. And we know that both vegans and omnivores have negative attitudes towards the other groups. And most samples claimed that they did not objectively dislike other dietary groups. So why do we have this asymmetry here? How do we make this add up? First, this could be a self-report bias. So it's possible that people don't want to report prejudice they have towards other dietary groups because they want to be seen in a fairly good light. And interestingly, this in turn actually increases people's commitment to the prejudice they feel. Next, we have population asymmetry. And what I mean by this is that we might have 2 vegans in a group of 100. Now they're going to encounter omnivores all the time when they're going around. They have much more opportunity to be the targets of prejudice. Whereas, say, some omnivores in a remote community, they may go their whole lives without encountering a vegan. So it's very likely that vegans are going to perceive more prejudice because we have more opportunities for it. Third, omnivores may simply not realize that they are perpetuating prejudice, discourse, or behavior. We know that societies which appear to support a particular bias as the norm tend to have citizens that adopt that into their own worldview as well. And it then becomes a lot harder to pick apart prejudice views from what we just consider the norm in a society. Finally, we see prejudice from many sources, and it doesn't necessarily have to come from one human. For instance, if we are at a restaurant and they don't have a vegan option to give us, we may view that as perceived prejudice, but it's not coming from a person that we can survey. This is a form of structural prejudice. We may be reporting this as well. And so there's something I want to touch upon quickly here. As you're hearing all this new information about dietism, you may be wondering if actually this could be turned around and used against us a little bit. So I just wanted to highlight that a multi-directional prejudice does not mean that this is symmetrical. The data we've just looked at, we can see that the harm is mostly flowing in one direction. We also know that this is an analytic framework. It's a framework just like racism and sexism and all these other kind of prejudice-based frameworks we have. These are multi-directional as well. And I talked about colonization a little bit earlier. And even though we have these multi-directional frameworks, it doesn't mean that we go around defending colonizers for their actions, right? So it doesn't have to be morally symmetrical. Power matters, and history shows us that naming a prejudice has always served to expose and limit the power of a dominant group. It has never served to enforce the power that a dominant group has when they are oppressing another. And it does matter who has power, because many forms of discrimination require structural power, like the example with the restaurant, with policies. This is, meat eating is a habit that is actually enforced as the majority position. It's socially subsidized by governments with agricultural policies, in cultural institutions, and in the media. These are not symmetric positions, and prejudice frameworks do not need to treat them as such. So what comes next? We have a wealth of prejudice literature since the 1950s or further to call upon when we're looking at interventions to address prejudice. These mostly investigate contact between groups. And under the right conditions, this is known to be really effective in reducing prejudice. A few years ago, Faunalytics reported that of advocacy people could remember, 33% experienced daily contact. And after this, 42% of those people reduced their consumption. And really importantly, only 9% of those people felt anger about the interaction they had, which is a lot better from the 49 who seemed to feel anger when they watched a disruptive protest. So what we can take from this is that it's perhaps a really effective avenue if we start exploring contact and good contact a lot more. And this is what we're doing now. So my colleague and co-author Monica Barnard at Sussex has kindly shared some preliminary results from a contact study that's running right now. And she's actually finding that these contact-based interventions with a vegan are correlated with more positive attitudes and stereotypes in omnivores, but particularly contact that seems to be non-judgmental. So Monica and I are coordinating our research efforts to cover multiple angles on contact. And this can be from like the quality of communication, the type of contact, whether it's face-to-face and the environment. And this might also be really useful for speciesism as well as another form of prejudice. So I have also recently taken 69 members of the public to a working dairy farm that is normally closed doors to test just this. I have this picture of one of the cows from this farm to show you all. So this was a contact study. Someone's a fan of the cow. So this is a contact study that we ran for speciesism. I'd be more than happy to talk to you more about that afterwards. So just to recap, I have some key takeaways for dietism. The first is power of communication. So we're seeing a lot more variation in people's diets, and that increases the need to communicate effectively and convey ideas quickly. With one word, we could invoke this shared understanding that a behavior or attitude is prejudice. We are part of something bigger, and language makes all these things easier to navigate. This applies to policy, research, and general public. We can then recognize it easier and with greater depth of understanding. Dietism is a human-human prejudice. By its nature, it takes the focus away from the animal, and instead it adds these layers and layers of ad hominem attacks against a person. And each layer is one more that we have to peel back before we get to what is really important again. And that's that we are not soldiers or extremists or militants or whatever they say. We are people who hold a socio-political stance against human-animal oppression. And so if we can recognize the distraction that this prejudice presents, we can get back to our message a lot faster. Lastly, we are seeing increasing political shifts, mostly to the right. Measurable factors like authoritarianism, the dominance orientation I talked a bit about earlier, these are all very much correlates of prejudice. And increases in prejudice globally are not good for us or for animals. So this is something we predict might become more and more important to understand and to tackle. And this political stuff is something that Christoph is going to talk to you a bit more about next, I think. So, thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you very much, Sam. Next time you get an hour to speak.
Sorry.
Then I don't need to do anything anymore. It's super interesting, very innovative research as well. So yeah, moving on to my talk now, and we'll focus on ideological resistance and also questioning that ideological resistance. So we often hear that those on the right side, on the ideological spectrum, would be not that receptive, would be really reluctant to accept any animal advocacy messages and would not be open for plant-based options. They might even reject the message. Also, they're driven by anti-vegan bias and they might show backlash effects, right? But what if that assumption is actually wrong? What is the evidence for that, right? So in my work in the past year, we've been conducting a number of studies to really look at the ideological drivers of resistance to plant-based options, but also to question whether advocacy messages would work or not work across the political spectrum, especially when we focus on moral appeals showing animal suffering, right? And the idea that people on the right might be unreachable for animal advocates is being reinforced a lot in media and in public discourse. Both on the right side and on the left side, we see these discussions keep coming up, saying that the right is committed to eating meat. It's part of the culture wars now. We can't really do anything about that. And then in right-wing media, vegans are being portrayed as threatening the culture, the traditions, the economy, and so on. In some countries, a bit more extreme than in other countries. I don't know how they did that in the US recently, but at some point in the elections, they were saying that the Democrats want to take away Americans' hamburgers. And the context for that was purely because the Democrats was proposing a couple of more policies that would address climate change. They were not even talking really about meat. It was just in general, and that's kind of the headlines that make it to the press then, really portraying them as a threat to American cultures. So it is an ideological issue, clearly, and this narrative, this cultural narrative is not coming from just nowhere. There's plenty of research showing, actually, that those more on the right side of the political spectrum are actually consuming more meat, are also self-reporting happily that they eat more meat and more animal products, very committed. They could not miss a meal without meat in it. They also express greater prejudice towards vegans, as Sam already talked about. And they also feel less inclined to say, I'm willing to adopt alternatives, I'm willing to try out something new. So there's quite a lot of evidence that this is indeed true. The more conservative you are, the more right-wing you are, the higher you score on this kind of negative measures that we don't like too much. But it's also important to recognize that there are actually different dimensions to ideology, and that is also often forgotten in public discourse or in debates. And in political psychology, we typically separate two different dimensions of ideological orientations. One is really focused on the social cultural ideology, and a good indicator for that is right-wing authoritarianism. If you're scoring high on that dimension, you're really preferring to stick to your traditions, to your family values. You're also very obedient to your in-group authority, submission to authority, and you don't like anyone who's stepping out of line or is acting in a non-normative way, such as vegans, not following kind of the traditional meat cultures. And then the other dimension is what Sam actually already kindly introduced. Social dominance orientation. It's a pretty straightforward one. It's the preference for group hierarchy in society. It's an ideological preference that some groups need to stay at top with the power and some need to be at the bottom. In terms of how these two kind of ideological dimensions predict these outcomes that we try to change. It is true that ideology predicts what's on your plate, but through different pathways as well. On the one hand, you get this idea that vegetarians and vegans are threatening the dominant status of meat cultures in society. Because they challenge traditions, they challenge the norms. So this is really not what those higher on right-wing authoritarianism like, right? They also, it's also not what social dominators like, but that's more because they threaten the dominant position of meat eaters in society, not so much about the traditions. The other pathway is only relevant for social dominators, as we found in lots of research, is that social dominance is the one that predicts speciesism, human superiority beliefs, and a general acceptance, moral acceptance that you can abuse animals for human purposes, really. That dimension doesn't predict general acceptance of animal exploitation. So there is a bit of a dynamic going on that we don't always take into account when thinking about how to reach the right with animal advocacy. So not all the ones on the right side of the political spectrum would find it acceptable to harm animals, and this is an opportunity, a window actually to intervene there. Most people do not like harming animals if you actually explain what's happening in factory farms, for instance, right? So that brings me, oh, actually, also need to show you this one first. These narratives, you can see them, or these discourses, you can find them a lot in...
So I'm in a smart hotel in London, I've got a cup of coffee, I want some milk. Let's have a look. We've got semi-skim, they don't like that. Oat milk, what on earth's that when it's at home? Almond milk, all I want's proper bloody milk, not left-wing options, proper milk. What's wrong with me asking for that?
So yeah, you see this is definitely prominent politicians, in, especially in this country and in the US, are kind of enforcing and reinforcing that narrative that it should be on the left side when it's plant-based, and they clearly didn't have right-wing options there in the hotel, whatever that might be. Going to really the core question of the research project that we conducted is, can the right be moved by moral appeals? And what we did is we designed two posters. We did one on the chicken topic and chicken meat, and we did another version on the dairy industry with cows, with pictures of the cows on the poster. And we presented to half of these participants these two posters. We first started doing a bit of the moral shock, like really stimulating those moral emotions that sometimes in animal advocacy movements, some people say you can't shock them, while evidence shows there are ways to do it without making, without triggering the backlash, especially if you follow up with a positive message, like here is how to address it. If you feel guilty or disgusted by what you've just experienced, this is actually following it with a more positive and an action-based approach. This is how you can address this moral discomfort by eating ethical alternatives. This poster was way longer with lots of facts that people typically want to avoid reading, but it was in their face, they read it, and then the chicken alternatives were presented as the kind of the issue that addresses these problems. Yeah, this is we tested this in about 1,000 UK participants from across the political spectrum. We had about 300 people identifying as right-wing, 300 as centre, and 300 as left-wing. And they also completed these measures that we have of right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. Because that's what's the critical question we have. If we present these posters to those scoring higher on these scales, relatively lower, how would they respond to this, right? We measured their moral discomfort, measured how likely are you to reduce your chicken consumption now, or your dairy consumption in the dairy version of the experiment. And we also let them evaluate pictures of food that we labeled either as plant-based or as real chicken. And actually, some of these are actually vegan products, others are real chicken products on the picture. But we actually randomized the label. It didn't really matter to really trigger that bias that the label only mattered. It didn't matter what was on the picture. The same with the nice dairy and dairy alternatives, the chocolates. You wouldn't be able to tell from the picture itself if it's vegan or not. We just labeled it and counterbalanced these labels across participants, really showing that the moment something is labeled as plant-based, we didn't use vegan, we used plant-based, you actually already get more negative expectations of how it would taste. We actually did this one in the lab as well, giving chicken tenders, vegan chicken tenders, two sorts, two types, two brands. And also there we already saw that even though all participants ate 2 plant-based chicken tenders, one was labeled as real, one was labeled as plant-based. They liked the one that was labeled as real a lot more. And that was especially the case when they were higher on right-wing authoritarianism, higher on social dominance. So clearly also in taste evaluations in the lab, those more on the right side of the spectrum show this kind of evaluative bias against plant-based products. But let's move on now to the findings. First, about just the main effects of this intervention technique, the strategy. What did the posters do without taking into account any ideological orientations? This is what we found. We found effects of the moral appeals across the board, across the 3 measures. Those who were exposed to the animal suffering condition compared to in control who didn't see any posters clearly felt moral discomfort, felt more disgusted, felt more guilty about eating chicken or consuming dairy products. They also immediately said, we will try to reduce our consumption now. They show higher willingness to reduce the consumption in the next couple of months and in the next week. And also the product evaluations, that bias against plant-based products was lower after they were being exposed to the suffering in the farm industry. Now, the critical question was, who was mostly persuaded? We did find significant interactions with people's ideological orientations. First, look at the ones higher versus lower on right-wing authoritarianism, the ones who are socially cultural conservative, so sticking to traditions rather than being more hierarchical thinking. We see these effects of control versus animal suffering, they are most pronounced among those higher on right-wing authoritarianism, not so much, a bit weaker, amongst those lower on right-wing authoritarianism. So across this ideological, social, cultural, conservative dimension, we actually see that it works across the board, but even best on the right side, not so much on the left side. Social dominance orientation, that's where the pattern flips. Those lower on social dominance orientation show actually the strongest effects of the manipulation of the intervention, while those higher on social dominance orientation show weaker effects, but still a significant effect. And this is the measure of intentions to reduce consumption. We found similar effect, even stronger for the moral discomfort measure, and then the evaluative measure showed the same pattern, but that was a bit weaker because the main effect was weak to start with already. So clearly ideology matters in terms of how effective these kind of posters are, but you need to take into account different dimensions, and they might actually boost, if you look at social cultural dimension, people who are culturally conservative respond pretty well on these messages in the direction we want. Those more higher on social dominance still show the effects in the desired direction, so no evidence of any backlash or like pushback reactions that they will say, oh, I will eat more meat now. They still show they shift more towards acceptance of, yeah, we need to reduce meat consumption or dairy consumption, but more weakly compared to those lower on social dominance orientation. Now, if I have time, I still have a bit of time. It's good that I kept it short. So we did a replication study as well. I ran this in January. Almost 1,200 UK adults participated. I added a third condition. where I used exactly the same posters as before, but I also added a national values appeal, because some of these animal advocacy organizations now start to, especially in Britain, start to appeal to national values. Oh, Britain is a nation of animal lovers historically. You can also look for it, and something to be proud of. So we thought, oh, maybe we can add that, because not only do animal advocates now use that more frequently these days, it also appeals, and that's the reason why they're using it, it appeals to kind of the mindset of British conservatives. Now, we didn't find, that's the green bar that was added, we didn't find any additional benefit of that extra trigger, actually using exactly that phrase. Might not be the strongest way to induce the British national values. But other than that, the pattern was identical. It was an identical replication. Again, those higher on right-wing authoritarianism show the strongest effects on reduction intention compared to control. Those lower on right-wing authoritarianism were not very responsive to these appeals. With social dominance orientation, again, it flipped. Low on social dominance orientation means you respond more strongly to the moral appeals and animal suffering compared to control, both in the condition that I presented before or in the condition with this additional national values appeal. Those higher on social dominance orientation show much weaker effects, but again, no backlash effects either, right? So to summarize these findings of this project, it confirms that animal suffering appeals actually works quite well in the UK across the ideological spectrum. And they trigger a moral discomfort in the way we expect. People start feeling more guilty. People start feeling more disgusted about this thing, and by eating these products. It does increase the intentions to reduce chicken or dairy consumption. We didn't test whether they actually translated an actual behavior. I don't think this was the meaningful setting to do it. It was it was Jared or Luke who talking about it, that there's a massive gap still between intentions and behavior. But this is the first kind of piece of evidence that they are responding in the way you want, but it would need a longer term intervention and follow-up to really see how that could translate in behavior change. And also from that first study, it led to more favorable evaluation of plant-based foods. So it kind of reduces this bias against plant-based food options, what in itself is already a good outcome to kind of reduce that resistance. And these effects emerge across the political spectrum, which was a key question of the research project, and sometimes even stronger if you hire on the socio-cultural dimension of right-wing ideology. So these are actually triggers. Instead of start thinking of how can we engage right-wings where they're at with their values that we might not share or that we might share, and reframing everything, we haven't even looked at, this is one of the first projects that really looked at how they respond to animal suffering, the basic animal ethics arguments that we use for promoting veganism often. And it seems like it's too soon to actually move to, oh, let's look what values they are holding and let's change or campaign materials in a way that matches their what they want to hear. I'm not personally convinced, for instance, that highlighting economic benefits, at least not for a general public, would work that well or is that convincing to shift people's behavior towards more plant-based food. That might work with policymakers and with people who actually decide on financial resources, but actually engaging members of the public in that conversation to shift toward more plant-based foods, I don't think these other arguments are always that convincing. Another piece of evidence that we've seen, especially around environmentalism, is that this seems to be the one that is most polarized as well. So even though the ones on the left side of the spectrum, omnivores on the left side, they might respond quite well on environmental messaging. It seems like now the backlash at the right side, especially when you start talking about environmentalist topics and climate change. Again, I don't want to make too strong claims about that, but that's the general impression I got from the evidence that there is. requires more solid testing as well. And I will leave it here. Thank you for your attention. These were all my collaborators and my 3 cats who did absolutely nothing for this project, but were always there throughout the process.
Cheers. All right. Well, yeah, thank you to the previous 2 speakers, and thank you everyone for coming to watch us today. Isn't it great to be here where everyone's on the same team? We're all making changes for animals. Good. 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 Let's go. All right. So I'm sure that a lot of us here spend a lot of time thinking about how we can get more people to go vegan. And I want to share with you today an idea that I call Vegan 2.0, which is going to extend our impact for animals and increase our impact for animals, and I'm arguing is much more important than actually being vegan. So this is the definition of vegan as the Vegan Society has it. Vegan is a philosophy and way of life which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation, ... And there's a few key changes that I would propose to this in order to upgrade to Vegan 2.0, and they come in this first section. So whereas with veganism we're talking about excluding as far as practical and possible, in Vegan 2.0 we're talking about preventing as efficiently and effectively as possible. The main difference, of course, is that with excluding, the goal is basically to get to 0. Right, the goal is to, if you exclude everything that you're doing in terms of animal exploitation, if you're the perfect vegan, you approach 0 impact, right? Actually preventing, we're going the other direction and saying we're actually going to impact more things than just the animal suffering that we're causing directly. Make sure you get one. All right. So, you might be enthusiastic about this concept if I would tell you that it would save 2 times more animals. Or perhaps more enthusiastic if I would say it would save 20 times more animals. But actually, we're going to be looking on the order of saving 30 times more animals. But it's actually not, it's 31 and a half. So, this is a central concept in this where we're talking about diminishing returns on additional effort, okay? We've got harm here, effort here, and early on when you're making no effort at all, i.e. you're just eating as much meat as you want to, right, you haven't done anything towards going vegan yet, at that point, actually taking a small step, like cutting out chicken only, and that's the only change that you make to your diet, you're actually going to be able to reduce a lot of harm for only a little bit of effort, even if you carry on eating other animal products. As we go down the curve, you've gone vegetarian, you've gone vegan, you get to a point where it's now taking a lot of additional effort to yield a little bit of additional reduction in harm. Right, so you have this kind of diminishing returns on your additional efforts. And a really good example of this is Jain monks. Anyone familiar with Jainism here? Yeah, okay, nice, woke crowd, all right, good, I like it. So as a practice of Jain monks, these guys are holding brooms, right, as well as the robes and everything. They wear light colors so that they can avoid harming any bugs that might land on them. And these guys are holding the brooms. And what they do, they have light-colored floors in their houses as well for the same reason. They walk around and they sweep the ground in front of them as they walk so that they don't step on any bugs. That's quite high effort. They're mostly vegan as well, by the way. Just they're not doing that and then having Big Macs. But they're sweeping the ground, so there's a lot of effort. They're going to the nth degree. But these guys are actually doing much worse than these guys. This is the next level of Jain monks. They will not only wear the light-coloured robes and do the sweeping the ground, they'll also wear a paper over their mouth to avoid accidentally inhaling bugs. And I think this is a really good example of diminishing returns on additional effort. If you're one of these guys and you're already wearing the light-coloured robes and doing the sweeping the floor and you're vegan, and then your Jain monk pal turns to you and says, you know, you really should be doing the sheet over the mouth thing as well. At some point, there's diminishing returns on additional effort, okay? So you're going to be making a lot more additional effort, and you're not really getting that much more harm reduction as a result. And we can think about this in more close-to-home terms for vegans. I think that we can only approach being the perfect vegan. I don't think that we can ever quite reach it. A couple of common examples that people may have come across in their lives. Medicines with milk powder in them. I'm sure people have encountered this, right? I need to take some medicine. It only seems to be available with milk powder in it. Am I going to not take the medicine that I need, and my doctor's telling me that I need, because I want to avoid the milk powder in the medicine? Personally, I would take the medicine. Leather seats in a taxi. If you order an Uber and he turns up and he's got leather seats, are you going to refuse to take the taxi? Again, I would probably just take the taxi, right? Now, you could be a more perfect vegan if you refuse these things, but again, you're going to get to this stage where there's a lot of additional effort and only a little bit of additional harm prevented. So this is the game that we're playing with what I call Vegan 1.0. You can exclude more things, and you get to a point where there's diminishing returns. You're trying to kind of be the ever perfectly more vegan, and yeah, you're getting diminishing returns. So that's why I'm suggesting the shift from a focus on exclusion. Didn't quite land on exclusion or excluding there. I'll say that again for the. That's why we're shifting to a focus on excluding, rather from a focus on excluding to a focus on preventing, because then we can escape this dynamic of the diminishing returns on additional effort. So the first thing I want to talk about, there's 3 parts of this: give more, share more, and do more. Okay, these are like the 3 tenets of Vegan 2.0, and I'll talk about each of them in turn and how they make impact for animals. So first of all, with giving more, I think it's useful to think about this in terms of outsourcing jobs or hiring professionals to do something that you wouldn't be able to do as well yourself. Right? It's people get a lot of fulfillment from doing vegan advocacy, but it's one of the many things that actually probably professionals who are in organizations with the proper infrastructure and contacts and so on most likely are in a much better position to do a good job of, rather than trying to achieve the same thing yourself. This is actually a room in my house. No, I'm joking, it's not. So this is a graph from Animal Charity Evaluators a few years ago, and it's looking at the number of animals estimated to be spared by the most effective animal charities compared to, in this case, animal shelters. And you can see that there's a massive difference between the two. This is per $1,000 donation. That's, if you give $1,000 to the average animal shelter, you're looking at maybe sparing 7 animals. Still very worth doing, right? But if you're thinking about it in terms of return on your investment, giving to the most effective animal charities, you can be expecting to save more like 4,000 animals for that same $1,000. So that's 579 times more animals helped per dollar donated. So not only giving to charities that can do this stuff professionally, but also making an effort to give to those who are helping animals most efficiently for that money. If you're doing this, you know, in terms of your own donations, if you think about giving £100, this is going to translate into giving the equivalent of £57,942.86 if you're deliberately targeting those most effective charities to give to. So this is really a way to massively amplify the impact of your donations, and you can know that it's extremely good value for money, basically giving to the most effective charities. It's four animals to the dollar, right? You can't say fairer than that. You can't get anything for $1 now, can you? But you can save 4 animals, so that seems bloody good value to me. I'll talk about a few of the charities in this category. First of all, there's the Good Food Institute, who I'm sure people are aware of, promote and support the development of the alternative proteins industry. They do policy advocacy and ecosystem building for plant-based and cultivated meat. So this is very much supporting the animal product alternatives that are being developed, and that is a really crucial part of the shift away from animal products. Next, we have the Dansk Vegetarisk Fooding, the Danish Vegetarian Society. And they are very, very good at influencing government. We've seen incredibly progressive things out of the Danish government, which is one of the biggest meat-producing countries in Europe. But they've invested millions into plant-forward food reform, and the Danish Vegetarian Society can take a big chunk of the credit for that investment. They also work with retailers to promote plant-based options. Again, they're focusing at the institutional level. If you can influence a supermarket, it's going to help many more animals than if you can influence one individual. And they've done workshops training dozens of kitchen professionals in plant-based cooking, which is another thing that comes up a lot in these effective animal charities, training chefs and interacting with food service so that they know how to do better plant-based stuff. Last one I'll talk about in terms of the effective charities is the Humane League. Again, I'm sure many people are familiar with. They have secured thousands of cage-free commitments from corporations, and they also focus a lot on alliance building with other animal organizations to promote pro-animal corporate and government policy. So it's cage-free policies at the corporation level, and then also a lot of commitments and pro-animal policies in the government level as well. I want to linger on this very briefly, because I know that some people are a little bit skeptical of welfarist efforts, and I think it's worth pointing out something that I think is often missed here, right? I do think it's good if the chickens who are on farms are in better living conditions and are suffering less. But I know that some people will take the view, well, you know, they're still ultimately going to be killed, they're still suffering, they're still being trapped and so on, which is true as well, right, and that's valid. But here's something that is kind of often missed with the welfarist efforts. Well, so this is a typical supply and demand curve. If the price of a thing is very low, then you have a very high quantity demanded. But you have, if the price is high, very low quantity demanded. Yeah, all right, yeah, good, that's the right way around. And where these cross over, you have what's called the equilibrium. So this is like where it sets the price and the quantity provided of any given good. Now, what we're doing with traditional vegan advocacy, we're trying to lower the demand, right? So we're trying to push down this demand curve so that at any given price for chicken, for example, there's going to be a lower quantity demanded than there was before because some people are not in the market for chicken. And the effect of that is to change this equilibrium point, right? The line's going to cross over at a different point now. The price actually goes down a little bit in that instance because you have some people who are now not in the market for chicken. But importantly, this is what we'll worry about, the quantity goes down. Okay, so they're going to have a smaller quantity of chickens being farmed as a result of that. So this is traditional vegan diet change advocacy, right? We're trying to shift that down, that demand curve. When we do corporate reforms and corporate welfare commitments, for example, cage-free commitments, what we're doing is pushing up the supply curve, right? We're saying it's now going to be more expensive to produce a given amount of chicken. You're not allowed to use cages anymore, for example. So producing a given amount of chicken, there's going to be a higher cost to doing that. So it's pushing up the supply curve. Now, again, we're going to change the point where these two curves meet and the equilibrium. So we're going to, in this case, actually increase the price, right? So we're setting some minimum requirement to producing it. And again, we're going to decrease the quantity. So it gets more expensive because you have to meet higher welfare standards. And as a result of that, there are fewer animals farmed. So that's a really important thing that I think bears illustrating like this, is that the point of welfare reforms, yes, I do think it's good that the welfare of those chickens is improved now, but something that's often missed is it is also going to mean that fewer chickens are farmed overall. So that's just a little bit on the welfareism. So there's a few organizations around that have done these evaluations of the best charities and where's the best value for money to give in terms of animal charities. And these ones in particular have done animals per dollar saved, animals saved per dollar estimates. I have aggregated a bunch of these into this lovely spreadsheet and found that the average of a bunch of different sources here comes out about 3.8 animals saved per dollar. So it's actually very close to that animal charity evaluators graph that I put up. 3.8 animals per dollar, again, bloody good value if you're giving to the best, most effective animal charities, right? So that's the give more part, and that is a massive lever that we can use to help far, far more animals than we could by being vegan. So that's the first part of Vegan 2.0. Second part is share more. This is a graph of the sources of influence. This is about 13,000 vegans responded to this survey. And this is what they said was the first thing that made them seriously consider going vegan. About 17% of people said a conversation with a friend or family member. 14% said a video on the internet. And a further 13% said posts on social media. We've also got 4% here saying reading blogs or articles online. So feasibly, close to half of these vegans who were reporting the source of influence that made them go vegan were by socially shared things, right? The social media or conversation or things that they'd seen online. Fully half of vegans in this survey reported that, right? So feasibly, by sharing things, by putting these messages, which is sometimes difficult to look at, in front of people who need to see them, it's feasible that we're doubling the number of vegans by doing that, right? There used to be, and I suppose still is, but to a lesser extent, a lot of fight for control of the printing presses, because this is going to be what is shared with everyone. This is going to be what everyone in the population thinks, and so it's incredibly important for who gets elected and what gets sold. And now we all have the ability to publish in the media, right, on social media. And I think this is an incredibly important avenue that we should be using and sharing as much as we can on social media with a pro-animal message. There's research that shows you should be looking to invoke emotional responses with the things that you share. So sharing things that makes people feel sad, angry, or disgusted about what's going on. Again, people won't necessarily thank you for sharing that in their feeds, but this is going to be the impactful stuff when it comes to getting people to change their diets. And yeah, I want to reiterate a point that Christoph said about sharing the animal suffering images, the factory farm images, the slaughterhouse images. A lot of people can get the idea that you shouldn't do that, it's going to provoke dissonance, it can be, you know, have a backlash and stuff like this. From the evidence that I've seen, there's a bunch of experimental studies which show different messages being compared, and it's pretty consistent that non-human animals are most likely to intend to change their eating habits, right, messages with that. Video about non-human animal cruelty was most likely to report intentions to change. Leaflets focused on non-human animal cruelty were most likely to give their email address to a veg starter guide. A bunch of these, right? An essay, right? This is leaflets again. Text messages, right? There's a bunch of these studies showing this same thing. Well, these are a little bit neither here nor there. But they are consistently showing that basically showing that animal suffering message is effective. So don't be put off from doing that by the idea that maybe there's dissonance or something else going on. I think there is dissonance, and that's an important part of the process to change. I'm sure that we can all remember a time before going vegan when you felt enough dissonance that eventually made you go vegan, right? I'll speed up a little bit. You can also share meta Vegan 2.0 content. This is my video about the concept, which has the benefit of lots of editing, and so I can speak much more smoothly than I can live. But sharing the idea of Vegan 2.0 and getting more people to do effective activism, I think that the difference between an effective activist and a vegan is much greater than the difference between a vegan and a meat eater in terms of expected animals helped. Right, so inviting those people who are already vegan to do more. Like the things that you see shared by your fellow animal advocates on social media, right? We're all kind of, you know, it's like when you put something out on social media, you're putting something out into the world, a part of yourself, and saying, hopefully I get some approval from this from somewhere, right? Certainly you'll be getting some disapproval from some quarters. So, you know, support people when you see them doing this. Make sure you go out of your way to like pro-animal posts and stuff like that, because that is going to be a predictor of how much that person does pro-animal posts in the future, right? Brief warning here, I do have some animal farm images on the next slide, so if you don't want to see that, you can look away now. If all of your posts look like this, you are going to end up in a part of the algorithm where you're only getting shown to fellow vegans who are liking those posts, and you're not really making anything that is going to appeal to the people who most need to see it. So it's advisable to diversify your content a little bit. You might share pictures of your nice vegan food, only if you're good at cooking. I don't do this. Or your pets, and these are things which are kind of still on brand, don't feel inconsistent with other things that you're posting, but it's showing like a more rounded view. You're going to pick up some more likes from the non-vegans. You're going to get into their algorithms more. I have to say this is advice that I could do with taking myself, because I do post like almost exclusively vegan things, which one shouldn't do, right? You should try and have a bit more about you to appeal to the mainstream, basically. So that's share more, and I think, yeah, as we saw, about 50% of vegans were initially influenced by things that they've seen online or conversations with friends and family, so incredibly important to do and to support other vegans doing when you see that happening. Finally, do more. To find this image, I searched for loser ant. And this is you if you're doing things on your own. You need to be doing things in a coordinated way, and then you'll be a winner ant with all your ant friends. The analogy can only go so far, all right. So there's a few platforms that you can do this. There are really good, low-effort ways that you can coordinate with other parts of the movement and do things where you can be sure that you're doing, you're one of several people doing it, and that way you'll be able to pick up rocks. So this is the Humane League's Fast Action Network. This is a really, really good site. I've got the URL down here. I'm going to share the slides at the end as well so you can see all of this. Basically, this looks like a feed. You scroll down this and it has different tasks for you to do, and the Humane League has people employed to research and then develop these campaigns and focus on a few very high leverage companies that they're going to ask for changes. And by doing this and sharing it in a way which is very, very easy to interact with at action.thehumaneleague.org, you just click through to these. It's got a comment for you to copy paste and a link to a Facebook post on the Unilever page in this instance. You can click through and do that, and then you're one of several people on this campaign. Submitting contact forms, emailing executives. They're generally all like pretty easy 60-second online actions to do. They also have a week streak so that you keep motivated to do it and don't want to lose your streak, and also a score. You can see here you get points for each of these so that you can be competitive with your friends. Who's got more points on the Fast Action Network? That's what I do for fun. I'm not joking. Yeah, that's a really nice feature of this website. I haven't seen anything else quite like this, Fast Action Network from the Humane League. Really good platform to make it, again, like very accessible, easy to do this kind of activism, right, in a coordinated way. This is the Raven network from the International Council for Animal Welfare, which is basically a similar thing. It's an email list rather than a platform like this. So you can get actions by email, and one of the really gratifying things about these is when you are part of a campaign and you're doing the posting, and then you find out that that campaign was successful. I've been doing this for about a year, and in that time, Subway has committed to a new cage-free pledge, and also Ahold Delhaize was a recent one committed to a cage-free pledge. And it's really cool when you see that and you go, oh, damn, I remember posting on their Facebook page. Okay, great. So it's really gratifying to be a part of, and you get to see the victories. And by doing this in a coordinated way, this is some of the results that we've seen so far, okay? We've seen massive increases in the proportion of eggs coming from cage-free systems. This is the US. They've got up to about 35%. In the UK, we got to about 72% of eggs coming from cage-free systems. And now, as you know, the government is most likely going to ban cage-free systems in the UK. So you get to a certain point, then it can go into law. And this is from coordinated activism that does rely on lots of ordinary people speaking up in a coordinated way, doing it all together, and pushing that forward. This is UK Voters for Animals. Again, I've got a link to this down here, and they organise political actions in the UK. So this is the Amasa Lobby Day that they organised last October, where a bunch of us, I think there was about 70 or so pro-animal people descending on Parliament on one day and all organising meetings with our MPs on the same day so that we could lobby for better animal welfare legislation. And this preceded by a couple of months, I won't say cause, but was surely one of the contributing factors, the publication of a really good and ambitious animal welfare strategy for England by the UK government. So an example of how, again, this kind of coordinated action, in this case through UK Voters for Animals, ukvotersforanimals.org, can result in real changes for animals if we're all doing it together. Another shout out as well, this is the last thing on Do More, communities against factory farming. This has been a really impactful thing in the UK, where they're organising basically pushback to local councils with arguments about river pollution and air pollution. It's typically environmental things, but it's very well leveraged because it is true that factory farms cause problematic pollution for local areas, and that is something that residents care about and that politicians respond to. And again, they have a feed of a bunch of different proposed farms with links where you can log easy objections, and they've been incredibly successful at getting a bunch of different factory farm planning permissions rejected. So this seems like a really high leverage thing to do as well. That's Communities Against Factory Farming. It's caf.org.uk. So those three sources, the Humanities Fast Action Network, UK Voters for Animals, and Communities Against Factory Farming, I think are really powerful ways. And again, they're all quite low effort, really. They're all like online things that you can do in a couple of minutes. But because it's in a coordinated way, it really does make a big difference for animals. So very quickly then, I'll wrap up, because I know we're coming up on the hour. Some advantages of Vegan 2.0. This is the progression of diets over the last sort of half a decade in the UK. And there actually is a bit of an increase, okay, for animal-free diets. It's like an upward trend here. It's pretty changeable year on year. It's not moving fast enough. And if we want to get to a position where we're post-animal exploitation, oh, I thought it was going to be a different next slide, never mind. We need this to go to 100%, right? At this rate, that's going to take a long time. So there's some better things that we can do. Here's a graph showing the difference in the number of animals affected by each of these. Okay, so we've got the omnivore consuming on average 146 animals per year. Flexitarian, about half that, pescatarian, vegetarian, and vegan. Like I said, if you get to be the perfect vegan, you get to 0. Now, if you go beyond that, if you convince somebody else, i.e. by sharing something on social media, to go vegan, there's another 146 animals, okay, per year that they're vegan. Taking part in organised activism, I think I've calculated this based on the donating X minimum wage. If you were doing this for minimum wage and doing an hour a week, you can expect to save another 1,378 animals a year. So this is several times what you would do by being vegan alone. And then donating, in this case I've suggested £50 a month, another 3,081 animals per year. So this is where I'm getting the 31.5 times more animals from. If you're doing all of these things, compared to being vegan alone, you can expect to save 31.5 times more animals. So it's like every day that you're doing this is like a month of being vegan. So that's this, right? This is the difference there. The threshold for mass adoption, as I mentioned, we're going to need that vegan line to go to 100%. But if we get to about 25% of people consistently setting this norm and sharing things and talking to people and making this, right, aggressively spreading this idea on social media, there's experimental evidence that around 25% of people committed to some new norm represents a tipping point where then it catches on quite quickly amongst the broader population. So there's a far lower threshold that we need to actually reach to get to mass adoption. And then we're at about 3% of people being what I call vegan 1.0. But if we look at the things that I've suggested doing as part of vegan 2.0, in the UK already 28% of people give to animal charities. Now, largely they're giving to like pet shelters, so they're not giving to the right, most effective animal charities, as we saw. But there is a much higher willingness to give to animal charities than to be vegan, based on what people are currently doing. And the 46% number is, there's actually an American number of the proportion of people who claim to be involved in some sort of social media activism. Right, so again, much, much higher willingness to take part in the things that I'm suggesting than adopting a vegan diet. And here's some data that we have on that. Right, when we look at activism, people think about frontline activism, your placard holding out in the streets, giving up your Saturday, and so on. Only about 15% of people said that they'd be willing to do that, compared to 41% of people who said that they'd be willing to give to animal charities, and 39% who said that they would be willing to do some form of social activism, whether it's social media or talking to people that they know. So again, much higher willingness to do these things and much higher impact for animals by doing these things. So to sum it up, this is the main differences I see between activism. We think about very high effort, very in-your-face efforts, which, by the way, I appreciate people who do this. So, you know, I'm not slagging off traditional activists. But the vegan 2.0 is the chill dude on his laptop and just, right, it's all quite low effort stuff that I've mentioned doing, right? And that's a key part of this. You can be vegan 2.0 very easily, basically. Doesn't require a lot of effort. And I think it's an important switch because when you are vegan 1.0, like I say, if you're doing it perfectly, you get to 0. And you get to these positions where you're trying to sort of tread very carefully through life so that you don't cause any harm to animals, and there's some amount of harm from crop deaths and things like this, and you're kind of, you know, on this view, it's like, ideally, I'd be dead. I mean, I've got to eat something, and I might step on bugs, but ideally, that'd be the best thing, right? That's the kind of ultimate attitude engendered by trying to avoid doing any harm. So it's like, if you're trying to be healthy or trying to lose weight, let's say, by obsessively counting calories, and then you discover exercise. Like, there's actually something proactively that you can do that's going to push it in the other direction and improve things. So you can go from kind of meekly treading through life and trying not to cause any harm and as much as possible have that's the thing that you're maximizing, to being a philanthropist or an activist, right? These are really important changes for animals, but also important changes in your own mindset and how you approach things. So shifting from vegan 1.0 to vegan 2.0 allows you to take on that much more proactive role and stop apologizing for existing. So join me in going vegan 2.0, give more, share more, and do more. Thank you very much.